First contact lasted exactly 11 minutes. It began at 0412 Greenwich Mean Time, when the array at Goldstone picked up a gravitational signature that shouldn't have existed, a mass reading equivalent to a small moon, decelerating from a velocity that made the tracking software throw an error instead of a number. By 4:17, 7 more of them had resolved out of the dark on every continent's doorstep, hanging silent and enormous above Earth's oceans like continents that had learned to fly. They did not broadcast. They did not blink lights in prime sequences, did not offer mathematics, did not do any of the 1,000 polite things humanity had spent a century imagining. At 4:23, the first ship over the Pacific lowered something that the news anchors would later call, for lack of a better word, a column. A shaft of visibly bent light connecting the underside of the vessel to the ocean's surface 40 kilometers below it. The water did not boil. It did not spray. It simply began to rise, smooth as a poured drink, played in reverse, climbing in a cylinder 8 kilometers wide until it vanished into the belly of the ship. At 04:23 and 40 seconds, humanity's 11 minutes of dignity ended, because that was when someone in the Philippine Navy panicked and opened fire. The response was not a war. It was a correction. A single beam, the width of a pencil and the color of nothing at all, unmade the frigate before its own gunners had finished the recoil of their first shot. Radar didn't catch a return trip. There wasn't a shockwave. There was a ship, and then there was a debris pattern settling into water that had already dropped 4 meters. By hour 6, 3 carrier groups did not exist anymore. By hour 11, every satellite humanity had put into low orbit for the last 60 years came down as a meteor shower with no romance left in it, because someone in Beijing and someone in Washington had both decided, independently in the same 20-minute window, that this was a fight and fights were meant to be fought. Coastal defense batteries in Norfolk fired until they had nothing left to fire. Coastal defense batteries in Norfolk ceased to exist. The ships kept drinking. By the end of the first week, sea level had dropped 9 centimeters worldwide, an amount that meant nothing to a swimmer and everything to an oceanographer, because 9 centimeters globally meant someone had taken enough water to drown Belgium 100 times over, and they'd taken it in 7 days, and they didn't look like they were slowing down. Coastal cities began to flood anyway. That was the cruelest joke of the invasion. The aliens weren't sinking anyone. Something about the extraction process bent the tides in wrong directions, threw storm surges into harbors that hadn't seen a surge in a generation, made the Thames barrier work overtime just to keep London's ankles dry, while somewhere over the mid-Pacific, a ship the size of a small moon calmly continued vacuuming up the ocean like it was room service. Humanity's militaries had thrown everything they had at 8 ships and accomplished exactly nothing except confirming, with total finality, that this was not a war humanity could win by shooting at things. That should have been the point where humanity gave up. It was, in fact, the point where humanity started paying attention. It was a hydrologist, not a general, who found it first, a woman named Dr. Priya Anand, working out of a repurposed conference room in Geneva with 3 monitors, a cold cup of tea, and 6 days of satellite debris to sort through before the satellites had stopped existing. She was building damage maps. She was trying to figure out where the ships had struck, so relief coordinators would know where to send people. What she found was a list of things the ships had not struck. They had not touched the desalination plant in Jubail, the largest one on the planet, sitting exposed and unshielded on the Saudi coast, close enough to 3 different alien flight paths that it should have been slag by day 2. They had not touched a single dam. Not the 3 gorges, not the Hoover, not the smaller reservoirs that fed 100 million people their morning showers. Fleet movements that should have leveled the Aswan High Dam in passing had instead bent around it, adjusting course by kilometers to avoid a structure that, from orbit, looked like nothing more than a gray line across a brown river. She flagged it. Nobody read the flag for 2 days, because everybody was busy watching cities not quite drown and writing obituaries for aircraft carriers. On day 9, someone finally read it. A colonel in what remained of NATO's intelligence apparatus, a man who had built his career reading patterns other people missed, sat with Annan's map for 4 hours and then did something nobody had thought to do yet. He asked what the aliens were for, not what they wanted, what they needed. Militaries think in terms of objectives and casualties. He made himself think like a quartermaster instead, and the pattern screamed at him the moment he let it. Every strike, every maneuver, every one of the 1,000 small course corrections buried in 6 days of chaotic footage. All of it bent around water. Not around people, not around cities. Around water infrastructure specifically, with a consistency that no accident could produce. The invaders had annihilated 3 carrier battle groups without hesitation and had gone 20 kilometers out of their way to avoid clipping a water treatment plant in Lagos that wasn't even fully operational yet. They weren't just harvesting water because it was useful. They were protecting the supply. You don't protect what's abundant, you protect what you're afraid of running out of. The colonel's report went up the chain in 9 minutes and landed on desks in Washington, Beijing, Brussels, New Delhi, and Moscow. Within the hour, each of them reaching the same 4-word conclusion independently, the way 4 separate rooms of the same building notice a fire at the same time. Water is the target. Not conquest, not real estate, not the thin blue marble humanity had always assumed was worth invading for its scenery. They wanted the water itself, wanted it badly enough to fight a war for it and still flinch every time a stray shot came near a reservoir. The way a starving man might rob a grocery store but still be careful not to spill the milk. It took another 2 days of frantic signal analysis, xenolinguists working in shifts on 3 hours of sleep, and one extremely lucky intercept of an alien communication burst that a Japanese listening post had recorded and a graduate student had, almost by accident, run through a translation model built for something else entirely. But by day 11, the picture was whole. The invaders called themselves, in the closest approximation the linguists could manage, the Thren. Their homeworld was a furnace of a planet 3/4 desert, orbiting a hot young star that had spent the last 200,000 years slowly baking the last free water out of their world's surface into vapor and vacuum. What oceans they'd once had were memories now, sacred stories, museum exhibits behind reinforced glass. Their civilization, spread now across 9 systems and countless stations, had one single load-bearing resource propping up everything else they'd ever built, and it was running out faster than they could find more of it. They hadn't come to Earth to conquer humanity. They had come to Earth because Earth was 71% water, and to a species measuring their remaining reserves in centuries, that number was not a geography fact. It was an act of God. The war room in Geneva that convened on day 12 did not look like the war rooms in movies. Nobody pounded a table. Nobody demanded immediate retaliation. There were exhausted diplomats, 3 flag officers who hadn't slept properly since first contact, an oceanographer still wearing the same cardigan she'd had on day 1, and a very quiet, very focused Thren linguist consultant patched in by satellite uplink from an underground bunker in Colorado, because half of humanity's remaining orbital communication infrastructure had been drunk by an alien ship the previous Tuesday. The Secretary General of the newly and hastily formed Joint Terran Command, a title nobody liked, assembled in 9 days out of institutions that had spent the previous decade barely agreeing on climate accords, laid it out plainly. We cannot beat them militarily. We have tried. We have lost badly, and we will keep losing if we keep trying the same thing. She let that land, because it needed to land, because half the room still wanted vengeance more than survival. But we now know something they don't know we know. They are afraid, not of our weapons, of scarcity. That fear is the only leverage we have ever had against them, and until 9 days ago, we didn't know we were holding it. An admiral, American, gray-haired, the kind of man who had spent 40 years believing that enough tonnage solved enough problems, said what half the room was thinking. You're suggesting we negotiate with a thing that murdered 40,000 sailors in a week. I'm suggesting, she said, that we stop trying to defend the water. because defending it has cost us 3 fleets and hasn't worked. I'm suggesting we make them believe that if this continues, there won't be any water left worth having. Not for them, not for us. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when everyone has arrived at the same monstrous idea at slightly different speeds. "You want to threaten to poison the oceans," said the linguist very carefully over the crackling satellite link. "I want them to believe we would," the Secretary General said. "There's a difference, and it's the only difference that matters. The Thren are not stupid. They are desperate. And desperate people, desperate anyone, do the math on worst-case scenarios faster than they do the math on best-case ones. If we can make the worst case credible, we don't need to make it true." It was, everyone in that room understood, the largest bluff in the history of the species. It required humanity's remaining nuclear submarine fleet, the only assets on Earth that had survived the first week entirely intact, because the Thren's gravitational extraction columns worked on surface water, and the submarines had simply gone deep and gone dark, rather than fight a war they couldn't win. To do something no submarine crew had ever trained for. It required them to go down into the deepest trenches on the planet, park directly beneath the alien collection columns, and open a channel. And it required every person on those boats to be willing, if called upon, to make the bluff real. The USS Colorado, a Virginia-class fast-attack submarine that had spent the first 10 days of the war doing nothing more heroic than staying alive in the black water off Guam, received her new orders on day 14, and her captain read them twice before she believed what she was looking at. Commander Elena Cho had spent 19 years in submarines learning that her boat's greatest weapon was silence, stealth, the ability to be nowhere, to be nothing, until the moment she chose to be something. She had never in that career imagined an order that asked her to surface, not physically but rhetorically, and announce herself to an alien battle fleet on purpose. The order was simple in its language and staggering in its implication. Descend into the Challenger Deep, the deepest point of the Mariana Trench, directly beneath the Thren extraction column currently drinking the Western Pacific dry, at a rate of 200,000 tons an hour. Open a tight beam communication channel using the translation protocols developed from the captured signal data. Deliver, verbatim, a message that the Joint Terran Command had spent 18 hours writing and rewriting until every word had been weighed like plutonium. And be prepared, if the message was tested, to follow through. The Colorado wasn't the only boat given these orders. 6 vessels, from 4 different navies that had spent the previous decade treating each other as rivals, descended into 6 different trenches beneath 6 different Thren columns within the same 48-hour window. The Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the deep water off Antarctica where nobody expected a ship to still be operating an extraction column, but one was. It was, Cho would say later, the first time in her career she had felt like she was part of something bigger than a single hull's mission, and the feeling was somehow both a comfort and the loneliest thing she had ever experienced. 6 kilometers under an ocean, the aliens above her were slowly siphoning into the sky. At 300 local time on day 15, the Colorado leveled out at 4,000 meters, well below her rated crush depth on paper and exactly where her engineers swore, with more confidence than Cho entirely believed, that she would hold. The sonar operator, a 24-year-old petty officer named Reyes, who had joined the Navy to see the world, and was instead currently seeing the inside of a trench nobody had ever meant to fight a war in, opened the channel. The message went out in the halting, machine-assisted grammar of a translation protocol built in under a week, imperfect and blunt in the way that only genuinely desperate diplomacy can afford to be. We know what you need water for. We know your reserves are ending. We know you did not come here to kill us. You came here to survive, and you are willing to let us die so that you can. We cannot defeat your ships. We have already lost that fight, and we are not foolish enough to keep losing it. But you should know what waits beneath every column you have lowered into our oceans. We have vessels, in every ocean on this planet, carrying material that will not simply pollute this water. It will render it unusable, for centuries, by any species, through any purification process you possess or we possess. We do not want to do this. We are telling you now, before we do it, because we would rather you leave than force us to burn the only thing you came here for. You have taken enough of our water to know exactly how badly you need what remains. Ask yourselves what happens to your reserves if what remains is poison. This is not a threat we make lightly. It is the only threat we have left to make. Leave, and the water remains yours to want. Stay, and there may be nothing left worth wanting. There was no reply for 6 hours. In the Colorado's control room, 6 hours felt like 6 years. Cho stood with her hand resting on the periscope housing out of habit, though there was nothing to see at 4,000 meters but the green glow of instruments and the quiet, terrified competence of a crew that understood, better than any admiral in Geneva, that if the aliens called the bluff, they were the ones who would have to decide, in real time, 6 kilometers underwater, whether humanity's threat was a threat or a lie. Reyes broke the silence first, headset still pressed to his ear, voice carefully flat in the way sailors learn to keep their voices flat when the alternative is screaming. "Captain, we have a response." The response, when the linguists back in Colorado finished untangling it from the Thren's dense, technically bristling grammar, was not what anyone in Geneva had expected. It was not a surrender. It was not a threat in return. It was, strangely, a question, and the question told humanity more about the Thren than 11 minutes of combat and 11 days of surveillance combined. Do you understand what you are offering to destroy? Do your kind grasp what water is, to a species that has none? It was the plaintive, wounded confusion of a party who had assumed, going in, that the calculus was simple. A young, undefended species with an abundance the Thren desperately lacked. A species that would fight briefly, and then, like every other species the Thren's expansion had encountered, capitulate once the cost of resistance became clear. They had not planned for an opponent willing to burn the prize rather than surrender it. That kind of willingness did not compute cleanly against a species that had spent 200,000 years learning to worship water as sacred, unspillable, a thing you protected at any cost because there was no more where it came from. Humanity did not worship water. Humanity had oceans it barely noticed, took long showers over, let rain fall on for free. And that same abundance, that species-wide relationship with water so casual it bordered on contemptuous, was precisely what let a hydrologist propose contaminating an ocean without the idea causing a civil war in the room. The Secretary General's reply, drafted and approved within the hour by a coalition of governments that had not agreed on anything this quickly since the invention of the Internet, did not soften the threat. It sharpened it, because the linguists had made one thing clear. Sympathy would read to the Thren as weakness, and weakness was the one signal that would guarantee the war continued. We understand it better than you think. We have fought wars over water that was merely scarce in one region of our own world, not absent from an entire planet. We understand desperation. That is exactly why our threat is real. A species that has learned to treat something as sacred does not risk it lightly, but a species that has never had to treat it as sacred has far less to lose by ruining it. You are gambling everything on our oceans remaining pure. We are not gambling anything, because we have 11 more of them. You have one answer that ends this without loss on either side. Leave our water where it is. Take nothing more. We will not pursue you. We cannot, and we won't pretend otherwise. But we will not watch you drink our planet dry. And if the choice is between that and an ocean neither of us can use, we have already shown you which choice we're prepared to make. The 6 submarines held their positions for another 11 hours. A number nobody chose on purpose, but that several officers in Geneva noted quietly, with the specific dark humor of people under existential pressure, mirrored the length of first contact almost to the minute. Reyes did not sleep. Cho did not leave the control room except once, briefly, and came back looking like she had aged a year in the time she was gone. At hour 11, the extraction columns began, one by one, across every ocean on the planet, to retract. Nobody in Geneva cheered when the columns went dark. There wasn't cheering left in anyone. The Secretary General watched the sensor feeds go quiet on every trench, every column, every alien ship beginning the slow climb back toward orbit. And she felt something closer to exhaustion than victory, because victory implied an ending, and this felt more like the moment after a held breath finally releases. The Thren fleet did not immediately leave the system. For 11 days after the withdrawal from Earth's oceans, they held position in high orbit, motionless, silent, running what the linguists eventually determined was a full internal deliberation. An entire civilization's leadership spread across 9 ships, arguing with itself about whether the humans below them were an enemy to be crushed properly once the shock wore off, or something else. Something worth talking to instead of drinking dry. It was Dr. Anand, of all people, the hydrologist who had first noticed the shape of the pattern nobody else had seen, who suggested the answer, the thing that finally moved the Thren from armed standoff to something resembling a table both species could sit at. "They don't need our oceans," she said, in a briefing that by then had grown to include representatives from every surviving government on Earth. "They need water. There's a difference. And it's the difference that got us into this mess, and it might be the difference that gets us out of it. There is more water in this solar system than in every ocean on Earth combined. It's just locked in ice. On moons, nobody's bothering to fight over. Europa, Enceladus. The rings of Saturn are practically slush. We don't need any of it. They desperately do. We just spent 2 weeks proving to them that our water isn't free for the taking. So let's show them where the water that actually is free happens to be." It took 4 more months of careful, exhausted, deeply asymmetric diplomacy, conducted notably without a single additional shot fired by either side, an outcome that surprised precisely no one who had been in the room when the submarines went quiet, before the Thren fleet accepted terms that neither species had imagined were possible in the first 11 minutes of first contact. Access, under strict human oversight, to the ice reserves of the outer solar system. Technology exchange, cautious and slow, in fields that had nothing to do with weapons and everything to do with water reclamation, purification, and conservation. Because it turned out that a species that had spent 200,000 years learning to survive on almost nothing had accumulated engineering humanity badly needed for a warming, thirstier planet of its own. And, buried in an addendum that took the diplomats longer to negotiate than almost anything else, formal Thren recognition that Earth's oceans were, and would remain, sovereign, untouchable, non-negotiable, protected not by treaty alone, but by the plain, unforgettable fact that the last time anyone had tried to take them, humanity had answered by nearly poisoning its own inheritance rather than hand it over. Commander Elena Cho retired 18 months later, the Colorado decommissioned with more ceremony than any vessel of her class had ever received. A small brass plaque mounted near her sail, reading simply, "Held the line at 4,000 meters. Never fired a shot. Never needed to." Historians would spend the following decade arguing over whether the bluff would have held if the Thren had called it, whether humanity would truly have poisoned its own oceans rather than surrender them, whether the submarines carried what the message claimed they carried, or whether the entire gambit had been exactly as empty as the aliens had feared it might be and simply never got tested. Cho, when asked in interviews years later, always gave the same answer, delivered with the flat, unblinking calm of a woman who had spent 11 hours in a trench deciding quietly, in her own head, exactly what she was and was not willing to do. "I'm not going to tell you what was on that boat," she'd say. "I'm going to tell you what I'd have done if they called us on it, and that's a different question. That's the only question that ever mattered." She never answered which question that was. Nobody ever needed her to. The Thren, for their part, filed Earth in their historical records under a designation that the linguists translated imperfectly but with a kind of grim accuracy that pleased absolutely everyone who read it, as the world that would rather have nothing than watch us take something. Humanity, largely, agreed that was a fair way to put it.